Definitely, happiness has to be on the top of all of the whole list. Yeah, and I'm just trying. I'm still haven't had time to.
The tournament organizers knew she would draw a crowd. They knew the Filipino fans would travel in droves, filling stadiums and breaking attendance records wherever she played. What they did not expect was that her mere presence would force the WTA to issue an unprecedented warning. Alex Eala has been given the green light for Washington. The Filipina superstar is officially entered in the Mubadala DC Open, ready to ignite the North American hardcourt swing with the same fire that made Wimbledon stop and stare. But behind the scenes, something far more controversial is unfolding. The WTA is watching closely. Tournament directors are walking on eggshells. And a final warning has been issued, one that could change how the sport handles its biggest rising star. Because here is what the governing body does not want you to know. Eala's popularity has become a liability, a force so powerful that it is threatening to disrupt the carefully controlled machine of professional tennis. And now, the warning signs are impossible to ignore. What did she do to provoke this reaction? And why is the WTA suddenly terrified of the very player who has been putting butts in seats? The answer will shock you. The tournament organizers knew she would draw a crowd. They knew the Filipino fans would travel in droves, filling stadiums and breaking attendance records wherever she played. What they did not expect was that her mere presence would force the WTA to issue an unprecedented warning. When Alex Eala officially confirmed her entry into the Mubadala DC Open in Washington, D.C., the tennis world took notice. The tournament, a WTA 500 event scheduled from July 27 to August 2, was already stacked with talent. World number 8, Alina Svitolina, number 13, Marta Castellano, 14, Naomi Osaka, and defending champion Leylah Fernandez were all in the field. But none of them were generating the kind of buzz that Eala was bringing. The Filipina superstar had just completed a historic run at Wimbledon, becoming the first Filipino singles player to reach the fourth round of a Grand Slam. She had defeated defending champion Iga Swiatek on center court. She had packed stadiums with flag-waving fans. She had turned the All England club into a home away from home. And now she was bringing that same energy to America. But the WTA was watching closely, too closely, some would say. Behind the scenes, whispers had begun circulating among tournament directors and governing body officials. The Eala effect was becoming a problem, not because of anything she had done wrong, but because of what her popularity revealed about the sport itself. Here is the truth they do not want you to know. Professional tennis has long operated on a carefully controlled model. The top seeds are marketed, promoted, and positioned as the faces of the sport. The WTA has its established stars, its proven commodities, its safe bets. And then along comes a 21-year-old from the Philippines who shatters every expectation and threatens to rewrite the rules. Eala's announcement for Washington was met with immediate excitement from her growing fan base. The Filipino community in the United States, one of the largest in the world, began mobilizing. Social media exploded with plans for watch parties, travel arrangements, and ticket purchases. The demand was so overwhelming that tournament organizers had to expand seating capacity just to accommodate the expected crowds. But for the WTA, this was not just a marketing opportunity. It was a liability, because with Eala comes the unpredictable, the unexpected, the uncontrollable. Her fans are passionate, loud, and unapologetically vocal. They have been known to overwhelm smaller venues, with queues stretching for hundreds of meters. At the Australian Open earlier this year, the demand to watch Eala was so intense that fans had to be turned back from Court 6, which was designated as Melbourne Park's party court. The tournament had scheduled a breakout star on a court that could not contain her. The WTA saw this. They saw the disruption. They saw the chaos. And they knew that if they did not act, the same scene would play out in Washington, Toronto, and every other tournament on the North American swing. That is when the final warning was issued. The memo was internal. It was never supposed to reach the public. But in the age of social media, nothing stays hidden for long. The WTA had issued a directive to tournament directors and officials: manage the Eala situation carefully. The wording was diplomatic, the language measured, but the meaning was unmistakable. The governing body was concerned about the unprecedented crowd behavior and security challenges associated with Eala's matches. They wanted protocols in place. They wanted crowd control measures. They wanted the chaos contained. But to those reading between the lines, the message was clear. The Eala effect was a problem that needed to be solved. The timing was suspicious. Just weeks after Eala's historic Wimbledon run, just days after she announced her participation in the Washington event, the WTA was suddenly concerned about crowd management. Never mind that she had been drawing massive crowds for months. Never mind that her matches had been breaking viewership records. Now when she was about to begin the most important stretch of her career, they wanted to manage her. Sources close to the situation revealed that some tournament directors had expressed frustration with the logistical challenges of hosting Eala. Her matches required additional security. Her fans required more space. The demand for tickets was so high that organizers were forced to reconfigure seating arrangements at the last minute. It was expensive, it was exhausting, and for some, it was not worth the trouble. But here is the question that nobody was asking. If a player is so popular that she forces organizers to expand capacity, should that not be celebrated rather than contained? The irony was not lost on Eala's supporters. The WTA had spent years complaining about declining attendance and viewership. They had struggled to attract new fans to the sport. They had watched as other sports, basketball, soccer, even golf, gobbled up the youth market. And then, when a player emerged who could single-handedly fill stadiums, they wanted to slow her down. The memo did not mention Eala by name. It spoke in general terms about rising stars and crowd management protocols. But everyone knew who they were talking about, and the message was impossible to ignore. This was not just about logistics, this was about control. The WTA wanted to dictate which players became stars, how they were marketed, and where they fit in the hierarchy. Eala had bypassed that system entirely. She had built her following organically, through sheer determination and undeniable talent. She had not waited for permission. She had not followed the script. And now, the governing body was trying to write a new one. The backlash was immediate. Fans took to social media to express their outrage. Filipino communities across the globe organized protests. Tennis commentators, even those who had been skeptical of Eala's rise, began to question the WTA's motives. The governing body had stepped on a landmine, and they had no idea how to defuse it. By the time the WTA realized the extent of the backlash, it was already too late. The Filipino diaspora had mobilized. Thousands of Filipino Americans from across the East Coast began planning their trips to Washington, D.C. Nurses from New York, engineers from Virginia, students from Maryland, families from Pennsylvania. They were not just coming to watch a tennis match. They were coming to send a message. They were coming to show the world that Alex Eala was not just a player. She was a movement. The Eala effect had never been about tennis alone. It was about representation. It was about a nation of over 110 million people finally seeing themselves on the global stage. It was about young Filipino girls dreaming of Grand Slam titles and hearing their own names chanted in stadiums. Eala had become a symbol of hope, and her fans were fiercely protective of her. Sinyu Wong, who had faced Eala in Auckland earlier this year, described her as an absolute fighter. The Chinese player admitted to feeling more pressure when leading 5-0 against Eala than when the score was love-love. That was the Eala effect. She never gave up, and neither did her fans. The WTA had underestimated the depth of that support. They had seen the numbers, the ticket sales, the viewership figures, but they had not understood the emotional connection. They had not realized that Eala's success was not just personal, it was national. Every win was a victory for the Philippines. Every loss was a collective heartbreak, and any attempt to slow her down was seen as an attack on the Filipino people. The fans who gathered in Washington were not just spectators, they were activists. They carried signs, chanted slogans, and made their presence impossible to ignore. The tournament organizers, already struggling to manage the crowds, were overwhelmed. The WTA's protocols were useless against a movement this powerful, and the pressure was not just coming from the stands. The Philippine government, which had been slow to recognize Eala's achievements, now had no choice but to step in. The Senate passed a resolution commending her Wimbledon run. Local politicians began appearing at her matches, cameras in tow. The nation that had once ignored tennis was suddenly embracing it with open arms. But the WTA was not ready to back down. They had issued a warning, and they intended to enforce it. The conflict was escalating, and nobody knew how it would end. The stage was set for the most dramatic showdown of the tennis season. On one side stood the WTA, the governing body determined to maintain control. On the other stood Alex Eala, a rising star backed by a nation of passionate supporters, and in between were the tournament directors, caught in the crossfire of power and popularity. The tension was palpable as the Mubadala DC Open approached. Eala had confirmed her participation, and the tournament was bracing for the biggest crowds in its history, but the WTA's warning hung everything like a dark cloud. Would they enforce their protocols? Would they attempt to limit Eala's schedule? Would they try to quiet the crowds that had become her greatest weapon? The answer came just days before the tournament began. Eala had been scheduled to compete in the National Bank Open in Toronto immediately after Washington. The WTA 1000 event was one of the biggest tournaments on the North American swing, and Eala was expected to be a major draw. But she had also been projected to climb to a career-high ranking of number 28, which would give her a first-round bye. The WTA saw an opportunity. If they could limit her exposure, if they could keep her from becoming too big too fast, they might be able to regain control. But Eala's team was not having it. They had seen the memo, they had heard the whispers, and they knew that the WTA's concerns were not about crowd management. They were about power. The governing body had grown accustomed to dictating the terms of success. They had decided who was a star and who was not, and they were not ready to relinquish that power to a 21-year-old from Manila. The negotiations were tense. Eala's camp demanded that she be treated like any other top player. They argued that her popularity was an asset, not a liability. They pointed to the ticket sales, the viewership numbers, and the global attention she had brought to the sport, and they made it clear that they would not be bullied into submission. The WTA, for its part, was cornered. They had issued a warning, but they had no appetite for a full-scale